Hello and welcome to the New York College Mental Health Podcast. My name is Deniz Uyanik. I'm a PhD candidate and a psychotherapist. And today, before we start, let me tell you a couple things. This is going to be our last episode of the summer. We are going to take a break with the academic year and we are going to come back on September. And today I have a dearest friend and really lovely person, poet, playwright, academic, activist, my good friend Konstandinos Dino Mahoney. And welcome, Dino. And
Lovely to be here.
This is our second take, and we couldn't make a recording because of the internet was so bad a couple days ago. But today I'm hoping we won't have any problems. But first, let me talk about a little bit what Dino does. Who is Dino? Dino is Konstandinos Dino Mahoney, actually, based in London and Greek island of Aegina, and Greek, English, and Irish heritage. And Konstantinos is a poet. He won the publication of his second collection, The Great Comet of 1996, Foretells, in the live Canon Poetry Collection Competition. He teaches creative writing at Hong Kong University, lecturer, and he blogs for the Asian Literature Review and is a rep for Barnes and Chickwick Stanza. He's also a big animal rights activist, going after all the cats in Aegina. He has a charity where he and a couple people trying to look after the stray cats on the streets of Aegina. And also Dino has a monthly poetry club, and he's been running through Zoom for a while, I think. But today we're going to talk about a different side of poetry a little bit, because, you know, you might think, what is the connection between poetry and mental health? But in a way, poetry is an expression of person's self and emotions, right? Can you help me understand a bit?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, there are publications called something like Poetry and Psychology. If you Google it, there's a whole field which recognizes the strong connection between poetry and psychology. And there are also increasingly groups of poets that gather together that share their poetry with the aim of creating good poetry, but also for therapeutic purposes. That central notion of therapy, of sharing your problem, particularly with other people who have the similar or the same problem, is a way of dealing with the problem or coping with the problem, even helping the problem to gradually get less and maybe probably not go away, but, you know, to make life easier. So yeah, so this kind of link between poetry and therapy and psychology is something I think a lot of poets nowadays, practicing poets living in cities and places or wherever, are aware of. I mean, I'm not part of that group because I don't consciously write poetry in order for therapeutic purposes. But I guess, to be honest, it's probably a byproduct. It's something that happens even though you're not consciously pursuing it, you know, because, I mean, what is a poet? What is poetry? I mean, we talk about poetry. A lot of people have got the notion of poetry as being something very romantic, you know, that the romantic movement in poetry in the 19th century, I think, had a very strong influence on people. So people who aren't kind of involved in poetry think of poetry as something beautiful about the moon, the stars, nature, flowers, expressing, you know, feelings, very much feelings based about the world and everything, the sea, the mountains and all that. But of course, but contemporary poetry has kind of moved away from that. Nature will always be a subject for poetry, of course, but it's gotten over the 20th century and the 21st century much more in your face. I mean, you can say anything in poetry. And I guess you can get away with it because it's quite a minority thing. If you put that on a screen or on a television, although let's face it, film and television is also getting quite in your face. But with poetry, because there's a small audience, because it's a bit niche, I guess poets and playwrights, the same thing you can see in happening in especially fringe theatre, small scale theatre, were often the pioneers of talking about things, writing about things, exploring taboo subjects. So in poetry, for example, explorations of suicide, a subject which a lot of cultures would see as taboo, would not want to talk about, would certainly not consider it a subject for recreational. You know, if you're going to sit down, what should I do? Sit down and read a book about suicide? You know, it's just, you know, and it's not uncommon to hear people saying, I don't want to read or see anything that makes me unhappy. That's a very common universal kind of response, I think, to creative stuff, whatever it is, films, books, art. But poetry's gone that way. It's gone down that road, and so it's delving into the subconscious. So, I mean, suicide comes from deep, dark things inside ourselves, complex knots that have never been untied, and in the end are destructive. So you know, and also sexual things. I think poetry has explored sexual being, again, very often a taboo thing, and often also breaking down gender barriers. Because increasingly poetry is certainly not the domain of the male. I mean, I'm sitting here. I'm a white, middle-aged, middle-class male poet. So I'm sort of, the only thing that I've got in my favor is that I'm gay. I mean, it's kind of a bit doomy these days to be white, middle-class, straight, carnivorous poets. You've got all the crosses there. But you know, like women are major in poetry. Women's voices in poetry are shining out, and you know, I have to say at the beginning, of course, I am coming from a tradition of Western poetry, English Anglophone poetry. Although, as I'm half Greek, as my mother was Greek, I am familiar with the Greek poets, but they're part of the Western canon now. But poets like Café have been extensively translated into English and are very widely known. And of course, I've read Asian poets, Chinese poets, Li Bao, and so on in translation. So it's not that I'm in a kind of a Western poetry bubble, but I am coming from that tradition. So my poetry practice has been quite strong when I was living in London, because I was lucky enough to be living in London at a time when poetry readings were flourishing. It became quite a pop. When I say popular, I'm talking about you get on a train, you travel an hour and a half, you go to a pub, a little bar, a tavern or whatever, and you go to a little room upstairs or a little room downstairs, and there are maybe sometimes 10, 15, but sometimes 40, 50, sometimes 100 poetry lovers who are there to listen to and share their poetry. So that so those were popping up all over the place. So it was a great opportunity to you know, to read and hear, and the same thing, of course, at the time was happening to music. I'm talking about London, but it applies to many other cities. That musicians were finding these little venues, these little back rooms behind garages or pubs or upstairs above a fish and chip shop or something or other, and they'd be they'd be playing their music. All they needed was some electricity to plug their gear in, and they play away. It was mainly a pub thing for music, pubs and rock pop. Not really pop, it was more rock, indie, independent kind of music. So those two scenes, that kind of music and poetry scene, was small scale, flourishing grassroots. And from that, there was no thought of. I loved seeing the breakdown there of age, gender, sexuality. It was really very, very mixed groups, but women's voices coming out loud and clear, very strong. Ask me another question because I'm rambling. I could go rambling like this for an hour, and I'm not sure. Is everybody losing the thread? I mean, it's all clear to me, but
here is the way I understand, or the way I see, perhaps. When you were talking about poetry, I realized how, even though, rarely people said, I must read a poetry book, I need some poetry right now, but it's all around us in a way. And it's all around us with the music, with the lyrics. It's now, even the popular culture is like rhythmic American poem, rap. It's an expression of poem. And especially in Western cultures, it is not just a person or personal feelings or what happened to them. It is also means for change, I suppose. And then you were talking about the suicide, and then I've been reminded of the Japanese traditions of death poems, or the way that we still put poems to be able to, in the tombstones, and then it's kind of everywhere. It's every day that poetry somehow touches us. Even the the movies and everything, it's kind of started with the poetic tradition from Greece, and then tragedias, and then all that
yes.
theater came to play. It's actually all around us. In a way, I see it as a way to keep our memories alive.
Yeah. I think from what you said there, Deniz, I pick up on a point you made, which I think we can expand a bit on, and that's the difference between poetry and poetic sensibility. So I think when you say poetry, people think of words on pages, and they think of strange shapes, because poetry is shaped in stanzas usually, not always. So you might have blocks of 4 lines, or lots of 2 lines. They're called couplets all down the page. Or if it's a sonnet, it will be a block of 14 lines with lots of white space around it and between it. So very different from the look of prose. And there'll be certain expectations from that language. The most common expectation is rhyme and rhythm. And rhyme, some people who are not familiar with poetry, if say, oh, that's not a poem, it doesn't rhyme. So you're supposed to say, I went walking in the morning frosty grass. It pierced my feet like shards of broken glass. So you've got grass and glass, and that's a couplet. That's just popped into my head. So it's just 2 lines, and you've got what we call an end rhyme. And that's what people often expect from poetry. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I quite like that image I just came up with. I don't know why I thought of it, but I did. And I thought, oh, I quite like that. Because the idea of frosty grass, well, in Greece, of course, you don't get frosty grass. I suppose you might in the north, in the mountains, in the winter or something. But I suppose it's a kind of a northern European image of the coldness and when grass is frozen, it will become hard and white and maybe look a bit like ice. And the idea is if you're walking across it barefoot, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it could be glass-like, piercing. So hey, we got a poem going here. So somebody has wandered out on a cold morning, and there's the frosty grass, so it's very beautiful. You can see this whiteness, but maybe a little bit of green peeping through. They're barefoot, and they walk out. Why has this person walked out? Why with bare feet when it's so cold? It doesn't make sense. Why would you go out? So immediately there's a mystery there, there's something to pursue, and there's something strange about it. Now, because it's a poem, you don't have to necessarily tell a story. If that was prose, then it's easy. You immediately get a story of, let's turn it into a little girl, and she's living on a farm, and she's got a new pet, a goat but she's living with her grandmother, and her grandmother says that the goat's got to stay outside, and it's tethered to a peg in the courtyard, and she wakes up and she sees it at night. It's been very cold and frosty, and she's worried about her goat. So she goes out, she closes the door softly behind her, and she goes out barefoot to see how her little goat is. So the story can begin. You can make a whole story out of that. But as a poem, the feet on the grass can become a metaphor. It can be a poem that's not telling a story, but can be evoking a feeling of loneliness, pain, emptiness, perhaps you're trying to evoke the strangeness. So the poem could just be about a feeling of alienation that is somehow summed up by walking barefoot on frosty grass. Of course, because you started with the rhyme, because you started with that glass rhyme, you've then got a duty, and it's 2 lines. You kind of then got a duty that the whole poem then has to be what we call rhyming couplets. That's 2 lines with a rhyme at the end of the line, with an end rhyme. So it's a challenge. So there comes the craft of the poet. So what are you going to say next? And what's the rhyme going to be? And the rhyme's got to be natural, it's got to be interesting, and it's got to be original. So then you kind of get a poem going. So that's a poem, that's the creation of a poem. But then contrasting that with poetic sensibility, very often critics
Before you go into poetic sensibility, I know that we will be carried away, but you know what just came to me?
Yeah.
When people come to therapy, they one of the, we always talk about Freud and how he started all this tradition, the modern psychotherapy, let's say.
Yes.
And one of the important things that he brought was the free association.
Yes.
Something that we keep using it. And it just reminded me free association so much what you said. Because sometimes people would come to me and say, I don't know what's happening. I don't know why I am this upset. And then we talk, I ask questions, they don't know. And I said, close your eyes. Just keep telling me, no matter if it's relevant or not, what image is coming to you, what feeling is coming to you. Keep going.
Yeah.
And then it's just, grass. And then the glass frozen, and then you were just going on. You said, maybe there's a girl here, maybe that girl, maybe something is happening, maybe it's night, maybe it just woke up, and then you just keep going. And this tradition, actually, it's still rooted, and then we used in psychotherapy to try to go into the root of the emotions or the things, because the way that Freud was saying is nothing is accidental, and he thought that we are going into some place because it has a place in our subconscious, and it has something is there. It's either an emotion, a repressed emotion, or it is something that a need is there. And in a way, how just 2 lines going into expression of emotion. And then you also talking about the symbolism, which is another thing that comes from psychotherapy tradition, goes through the dreams. We see dreams, they often don't make any sense. And sometimes we spend lots of time. They said, I woke up and then it was frozen, but somehow I didn't have any shoes. So I went out, and then glass was frozen. And then it cut me. And then we said, what does grass means to you? And then what do you have any memories about shoes? And then you go and you construct a meaning from it. And perhaps poetry is also a way to share shared meanings without meeting each other.
Yes, yes. All that, I completely understand what you're talking about, and that all makes sense to me. And you've also jogged my memory. When I was in London, Freud lived in London. Obviously, you know that
Yeah.
for a long time. He's from Vienna, but he ended,
But
was he? Oh God, I'm getting it. He wasn't. He was before the Nazis, wasn't he?
no, it was during the Nazis when they
It
started
was the Nazi
in
period. So
Vienna.
he
He has
So
to.
he left Austria, didn't he?
Hmm?
Because he was Jewish, and he didn't want to get caught up in the horrors of the Germans Holocaust against the Jews. Yeah, and so he lived in London, and they've turned his house. I don't know. Have you been there? The Freud Museum.
I've been to online version that you can actually go and see the whole museum online, like the one of the 3D
Oh, that's
reconstructions.
something your students might be interested in doing.
Yes.
Yeah, you can just type in Google Freud Museum London, and then you get a virtual tour and stuff.
Mm.
Well, they always have fabulous talks. I've registered with them and I get all their emails and stuff, and they do fabulous talks. And I went to, you've just reminded me, Deniz, that I went to an all-day session, a symposium on poetry and Freud, and they had people talking about exactly the sort of things that you were just mentioning and deconstructing poems. So that was something that the Freud Museum, which is it's a very active museum, it's a teaching museum. So they have a lot of workshops and seminars and so on. So yes, so totally symbols are central to poetry. There is, of course, a movement in poetry called the symbolist poets, like H.D. Hilda Doolittle is a famous example of that, an American poet who lived in London most of her life, or a central part of her life. And those are poets that really recognize the centrality of symbolism in poetry and kind of work through it. So her poems, H.D.'s poems, for example, are all symbols,
Mm.
and the important thing about poetry is don't explain. It's a no-no. You mustn't say, so for example, in our poem about the frozen grass and the bare feet, it would become a bad poem if I sort of said, and the frozen grass was his open wounds, and the bare feet were his bare soul, and the
Mm.
frozen air was his painful past lashing at his bare skin. If I spelt it out like that, the poem would kind of it would be like a balloon that was going out and suddenly sort of came in on it and itself, because the magic of symbols is that they mean something different to everybody. They're shifting. Although, the poet themselves might have an idea of what that symbol is, but very often they don't, like you were saying. So, for example, the frozen grass and the bare feet just popped into my mind. So I don't know. So if I were with you or with a therapist, just as you said, that line of questioning could start to unpick it. But the magic for the poet is not to unpick it until you finish the poem.
Mm.
So it is a process, and that's probably one of the things you have to have if you want to be a poet. You have to have the ability to let your mind float free.
Mm.
And very often poets are compared to children, in that children know how to play. It's instinctive for them. And you can just put two children in a bare room and they can turn that room into an island, a desert island, and there's crocodiles on it and sharks swimming around it. Or they can turn it into a spacecraft and they're flying off to the moon and they're looking through the windows and they're seeing the stuff. They can turn it into whatever they want, that transformational power of play. And it's something instinctive to children, although of course traumatized children, I guess children from, there's that whole thing there about war children very often have to relearn how to play, because their childhoods have been kind of stolen from them. Because what do you need to play? You need time and space and peace.
Mm.
And you need not to be hungry. You need to have all your bodily, you need not to be thirsty, not to be hungry. You need to feel safe. You need not to have somebody telling you you've got to do something at such and such a time. And then shove it off, usually, but you don't even have a child. Children can play alone, but usually where people are gregarious, we're social creatures. So put a bunch of children together, they start creating all these worlds, and they don't think twice about it. And that's the poet. When you sit down, your mind, it's not your body though, it's your mind. So you don't, not like a child's play is very physical as well as mental. The two things go together. But the poet would just sit, but they need not to be hungry, not to be thirsty. They need to be quiet. They need not to have to, the plumber coming round, or they've got to go to work. And then if they're peaceful, then their minds will start playing and jumping. And free association is very, very important. I mean, I tell you what I could do. It might be interesting. When we finish talking, I could finish that poem and send it to you, and I'll do it freely and see what comes of it, and then
Yes.
it might sort of reveal something, or at least it will be fun to sort of try and unpick it or have a look at
Deconstruct
it
it after it's finished. And but I guess in here, the one difference in doing this inside the therapy, it is free of judgment. It is not aimed to find the beauty in it. It is not aimed to, attack it from where it is. It's not looking after to make it more beautiful, more appealing. They say there is a meaning here, and the way that you construct it may not be accidental. And if these meanings coming through you, maybe there is something.
Yes, absolutely. That's a very important point that you make about judgments. Very often when you send poetry, because poets, what do we do? It's very important for us to be published. For not all of us, but for a lot of us, to have, like artists, like to have their work displayed on walls in galleries and so on, and musicians like to have their music on Spotify or in a concert or something. Poets like to read it, or they like to have it published in magazines, very often little magazines with small circulations, but to other poets, and very often the editors will really make a point of saying that the poetry should absolutely contain nothing misogynistic, nothing homophobic, nothing this, nothing that, nothing the other. It's got to be free, and so in a sense, there you are working within certain limitations, but they're quite valid. They're quite valid limitations.
But if it's the culture puts boundaries on personal expressions, and one thing that we kind of know, which is if there's a thought, no matter how offensive it is, if there's an emotion, when it's expressed and openly talked about, it loses its grip on the person.
Yes.
And sometimes you've been talking about, and all I was talking about, I'm Turkish, and I'm thinking about the Turkish, the poetry and all, and there are movements, and people, whenever there's a new movement come in, people kind of said status quo or culture, the way to write poems, the way to express ourselves is too, it just doesn't allow us to say what we want. And then they introduce something new, it kind of opens a travesty, and then it says, oh, this is awful, you cannot do this is not art, you cannot say these things, and then it changes.
Yes. That we're kind of we're moving into another area of which of course is a big social debate at the moment, and that is any form of control of what we say, political correctness, that whole issue. It's a term that's been floating around for a couple of decades now, but it's come to the forefront because now we talk about the culture wars. And a lot of right-wing politicians bash the left by pointing at what what they're writing and what they think is bad and or they look at they see that any attempt, well, it's complex, isn't it? Sort of any attempt to talk about things that you shouldn't talk about is an infringement of freedom. So what are the boundaries between hurting people and expressing yourself freely? Deniz, I was just thinking at this point, I'm thinking of I'm talking to you, but behind you, I can see your students. And I'm thinking I've been to talks like this that you talked about something, but we haven't actually had an example of it. We've done a little bit of composition. So I was wondering whether it would be a good time to read a poem now.
Yes,
So we actually have an
I
example.
think that's what
This
we
is
need.
a poem, sort of thing.
And but we also need to go back to poetic expression as well. It's like there's poetry and then there's a poetic expression, and then
Yes.
I think it's also important to talk about, because
Yes.
what I would like to bring it as, and one thing before you go with, because I know after you read it we are going to get lost in what you read. I'm hoping it's one of the things that you write, one of the beautiful poems that you write, but the way that I'm thinking is, I'm thinking as a way to express ourselves, and it doesn't have to be, and it can become, and not everything has to be published, and it can be part of the journey that the person goes through. It's a way to express themselves. And because we talk about symbolism, but I also know that many poets just write about themselves, and they said, I am right, or when I think about it, I'm always reminded of Nazım Hikmet, which is he was like called, I think, romantic communist, and he became part of, and he wrote about his country, but he was exiled, and he wrote about exile, and I think he spent 30 years of his life in prison cell. But
what's his name?
Nazım Hikmet.
Hikmet, yes, the great Hikmet, yes.
And so I'm talking, and then I'm just thinking about, again, although it is a shared, the Rumi is quite well known around the
Rumi, yeah, everybody knows Rumi now. Rumi's huge. Is it Hikmet that wrote that beautiful poem? And then he says it's about life, and he says something about that the great thing is for an old man to plant a tree, and it and it doesn't matter that the trees, obviously the old man might be 90 years old, but he's planting a tree, a sapling, and the tree takes years and years and years and years and years to grow, but he plants it with love and hope, and it's a beautiful symbol of eternal spirit in people. That's him, isn't it? That's Hikmet.
Yes, it's I'm sorry for my crude kind of translation. It says it's about to live. It said living is not a joke. You have to live with seriousness, like a square.
Yes.
Which means there will be nothing else for you other than living. This will occupy everything. You have to live seriously. You have to live in such a way, even if you're in front of a death squad, or you have all your glasses and doing science in a laboratory, you will be able to die for other people, he says. And he says living is something serious. Even in your 70s, you have to plant olive trees, he says. It's not because your children will inherit it. It's because living is something worth.
Yes. I know, it's fabulous, isn't it? Living, that opening line. This is Nazım Hikmet. He was born in 1902, died in 1963. So he's the first part of the 20th century. Great Turkish poet. But he translates well into English, doesn't he?
He does.
And so when you read it in English, it's actually, you don't feel it's translated. That some poets are lucky like that, like the Greek poet Café. He translates very well into English. Other poets, it's trickier. So living is no laughing matter. You must live with great seriousness. Isn't that wonderful?
Yes. And even this morning, and that I saw it on the TV about Rixos and his translations, and then they were talking about Rixos, talking about his poems. And I suppose we are also in a country where the poetry is something quite serious, and it is rooted.
Yes.
But let's go back to your poem. Now, I know we are getting sidetracked a little bit because this is something that I quite like to delve into.
We're creating a poem because, in a sense, our conversation is free association.
It is.
So you say something and I bounce off that. I say something, you bounce off that. Because, dear watcher, we have not pre-prepared this, as we shouldn't, you know, so we haven't said we're going to talk A, B, C, D, E. But I always think the best conversations are like this, where you freely sort of respond to everybody. Okay, so I have a poem here. It's from my first collection. It's called Tutti Frutti, very pink camp cover there. And I've got various poems in it about my mother. Poets will always write about their parents. It's almost a given. Like every poet will have their mother poem, their father poem. Not only one, they often have many. And like most people, not everybody, but like a lot of us, that my mother was very important in my life, and but she was Greek mother. So Greek mothers, well, all mothers, are strong, but Greek mothers, like Jewish mothers, like Italian mothers, like everyone can be very demonstrative. They can also be a bit possessive on the possessive side. The love has got two sides to it. If you love me, set me free is kind of a central tenet of the philosophy of love, and that applies to all sorts of love, so even if you're husband and wife, boyfriend and girlfriend, girlfriend, whatever, let the person be free, and then they can love you. Don't be jealous. Don't crush them to you. And Greek mothers have a tendency, or my mother did anyway, bless her, to be rather possessive. Wanting me to be very, very, very close to her. And so I wrote a poem about that. And I sent it off, and then almost to my heart, because of course poets want to be published. But then when I got a letter back, it was the days of letter. It was pre-internet. I suddenly got this thing saying, "Oh, we like your poem. We want to put it in an anthology." And at that time, of course, easy to hide. I just wouldn't. But I suddenly was filled with fear that she would see it and be horrified by it and hurt by it. But anyway, it's called, I'll read it to you. It's called Vampire Madonna. So I think in the title, you kind of get it. You get the antithesis, the paradox.
Let's talk about it afterwards. Let's hear it.
Okay, Vampire Madonna. At 9, I gave you a valentine, plump red silk heart. My love for you burns like a flame in darkness, I wrote. Before that were your breasts as you sat on your bed, deciding for once not to cover up. Later, I killed you off in a dream, your bier drawn by glossy black horses with purple plumes. I spared no expense. When I fled north to university, you bombarded me with food parcels, home-baked cakes heavy as guilt. And when I came home between terms, hiding behind a mess of long hair, you fed me so that I could hardly move. Then you wrecked my marriage, and completely broken, I came back, and you hunted everyone I loved. Once, on a Greek island, I saw a woman call her son from the sea, Kostaki, Kostaki. He waded out balding, pot-bellied, hair-chested, and she wrapped him in a towel and led him away. So heavy stuff, Russ.
Thank you for that. And you know how I would start?
Yeah.
Before thinking, I was like, how does that feel? You know, I would just stay inside and present and thinking about what's it, because in a way there's kind of a bit longing and sadness there that I felt. It's like kind of a need, kind of a want to connect without going into whatever that you said. That's how I felt in this moment. And it's sad between you and me when you were reading. I don't know what you think.
Yeah. So you felt say again, what did you feel? A longing?
I first of all,
In the poem, I mean.
Yes, there's a sadness
Sadness, yes, yeah.
And there is like this need, there is something is, you know, a child wants love, but it's kind of not returned love. And then there's this need to be with the mom, and there are all these needs, there are all these expressions of love, which is kind of rejected, is it?
Well, you know, so post hoc, I think the poem is really it's a classic Greek boy poem to his Greek mum. It's kind of like saying you love me too much, you interfered in my life too much, you tried to have too much control of me, and it ends with because I wrote this when I was in my I was probably, I don't know, 20 or 21 or something. And it's so that image at the end of a Greek mother calling her son, and it's based on reality. I mean, you can pull things into your poem from reality. I mean, I was on a Greek beach and I did hear that, you know, an old Greek lady kind of calling into the sea, and this man wades out, and it's her son, and she's treating this mature man who's, you know, hairy body, bald head, and she's still treating him like a baby. She wraps him in a towel, you know, and it's all, oh, you'll get cold, you know, come home. Oh, you must be hungry. Let me take you. And for me, it was a vision of horror. I thought, oh no, I don't want to end up like that.
The reason that why I started like this is what's happening is here. I kind of express how I felt. And then you said, wait, there is more to that. Here is how I see it. This is like, I seen it as
yes,
need for more love. You said need for freedom. It's too controlling. But
yeah,
you see, now we are constructing a meaning. And this actually, this actually brings me into really important point. You know, we talk about therapy, and in therapy we build a relationship, and this relationship needs to be therapeutic. When you're in therapy, relationship has to be therapeutic. But art, especially poetry or great friends, moms, our relationship with others can also be therapeutic. It is like healing. It is like bringing emotions and being able to share something.
Yeah.
So,
yes, and if I could just quickly jump in there and say that you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a whole school of critical thought, postmodernist critique, which really emphasizes the primary importance of the reader rather than the writer. So that kind of happened in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. It was quite revolutionary. It divided. It was quite explosive, because suddenly the critics were saying, no, it doesn't matter what the poet thinks. It doesn't matter, or the writer. It's just all writers. it's the reader. Texts are not stable, they're unstable. They move around, they shift around. You look at them, they're like clouds, they change shape. And so what I was doing then, actually, it was kind of like I was trying to throw light on the poem, but absolutely, you were, you know, a postmodernist critic would say, but you can't dictate what, you know, what the poet means. What do you think that's what it means to you? But it's very interesting that for you, what came across was something.
Didn't intend.
Yes. Right? Well, not that I didn't intend, but that I wouldn't have foregrounded when I was explaining the poem, but recognize that that it's there.
And actually, this brings me an important point. This is also how we kind of find meaning with every kind of interaction. If this was a real life conversation and you were talking about your mom and I was telling you, I told you something and I had a different meaning than you might have a reaction. And you might say, how dare you making this meaning? I will not talk to you anymore. Or you would like try to change the conversation. So it also always brings me back into personal relationships and maybe perhaps a little bit more psychotherapeutic approach, because this is also what Freud was saying, it's transference. But he was saying that not just what we say, what we do, how we look, how we appear, and most importantly, how people tend to read your actions and read your emotions, called transference. And therefore, this, in a way, I think there is a modern approach with, especially in theaters and movie clubs and some of the poetry clubs as well, they're trying to figure out a transference, shared emotion and shared meaning.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I mean that I have I run a salon on Aegina for that's film. So we watch a contemporary art house film. So we don't watch kind of a Hollywood blockbuster or anything, but we'll watch you know, like a minority film. And then we talk about it afterwards, and it is interesting because there's very often disagreements, especially with the fundamentals of like and dislike. I mean, that's number one. Did you like it? Did you not? You know, so you deal with that. But then, you know, deconstructing the meaning of the film. What did it mean to you? And it is a great way. It's a catalyst for opening up. So we're opening up to each other. In a sense, all opinions reveal something about ourselves, and when the evening goes well, it flows to a natural conclusion. So in the end, although there's an agree to disagree very often, then there's a nice feeling because there's been an honest exploration of, I suppose, our intellectual and our emotional worlds, and sharing it, I suppose, in a sense, is a nice therapeutic's too strong a word to put on it, I think, but it's a lovely communal, it's an opportunity to share things that maybe in daily life, where do we have that chance? I suppose that's why we have things like salons, poetry groups, spaces that we create, spaces where we can share things that aren't just transactional, because very often, you know, we go out, especially in the workplace, but with all the conversations about making something happen. You know, an obvious example, a bit crude example, is if you're a salesman, you know, and you go to your office and you spend all day phoning people up and trying to get them to sell things, or going to showrooms and what have you, and then you get home and maybe the conversation is about what you're going to have to eat and what you're going to watch on television. You sit and watch television, you go to bed, and then start all over again. So the whole thing's transactional. But if you you know, with discussion groups, poetry groups, book groups, and so on, you know, you've got spaces there to sort of just float and just explore.
Mm-hmm. The last episode, Christina was talking about different expressions of self, and Christina was saying that we have different selves. Perhaps you have a self that is a poet, and you have a self that
Yes.
is a worker, working in some place. You have a self that when you go shopping, and the way that you construct meanings change. And perhaps these kind of prunes can also be an opportunity to transform and turn into a journey about, finding
Yes.
your own
Yeah.
emotions, finding your own meanings, and try to make
Yes.
sense of it, recognizing it.
Yes, yes. I think that's true. I watched that podcast with you talking to
Mhm.
Christina. It was really
Mhm.
interesting. I really enjoyed it, and it really resonated with me. What Christina was saying about having different selves, and it also made me think about the importance of when you're talking to people that you see through whatever. You don't just treat them. For example, a crude example, like when workmen come to your house. Um, to have a little bit of human interaction as well as just talking about the what's wrong with, because these are people, they've come to your house, maybe it's a hot day, they're tired, and and then you've got something wrong with your electricity and they fix it and all that. But then to have, at the end of all that, to have just a little bit of conversation and a little bit of interaction, which is talking to them as people rather than them as electricians, as a crude, simple example that's just popped into my mind. But yeah, when Christina was talking about that, I was thinking, yeah, it's nice to recognize that people have got different selves. And there's usually one self, which is the most lovable self, which is the little person inside us all, the childlike person that's there. And if you ever have a chance to sort of like reach out to that, that's that's I think when you get the best interactions, when you're talking to the child and the other person. And poets, talking about free association and play, as we were at the beginning. I love I love all people. I don't care what they are, who they are. But I have to say, I do enjoy being with poets because I find they're very playful. I mean, I've recently had poets staying with me. They've come over, from England and Belgium and places. And I mean, I just find we just a lot of people say, "Oh, you're being silly," you know, all these adults being silly, but it's the poetic mind. It's playful. You want to sort of toss things in the air, make sort of strange associations and puns and observations and so on, and that's very important.
The play is how we test the world, and then in a way you would be familiar. I'm sure that there's a notion that as person becomes an adult, they lose their side that plays, that gets excited,
Yes,
that imagines things. And
yes,
perhaps a
yes.
poet is a person who would still play and explore.
The poet is an eternal child.
Now, I think in there are like a couple hours of discussion, perhaps. An eternal child. But then this brings me something else. Are you familiar with attachment theory?
Detachment.
No, attachment theory.
Attachment. Is it when you're particularly attached to an object or something in
It's
your
a
life?
rather new way of understanding. And we said, and when a child borns without having all the cognitive and emotional abilities to process.
Yeah.
So they need a caregiver. They need a mom. Just from your what you wrote, and then they need a mom. They need a dad, and they need to be able to play, and they need to be able to learn from a childhood before almost even saying their first word, how to interact with the world, how to trust the world. And there is a overgrowing literature. It's saying that the way we connect with our primary caregivers, with our moms, with our dads, it kind of becomes like a template. and how we interact with the world. Because in what you wrote, that you were talking about, I said breastfeeding. Because it's love and attention, and mother is caring for you. That's a feeling. And you were also talking about trauma at some place, in a way that if that connection is broken, in a way, you'll never learn to connect. And your way of, I don't want to say broken, I don't think it's a correct way to say it, but usually the literature says secure and non-secure attachment, anxious attachment, or these different kind of attachment styles, and it starts with childhood and it continues, and even adults has, although names are changed, they're coming from the same place. And I wonder, you said a poet is an eternal child. When you say that, and a person stays as an eternal child, also poet is a child, is always eternally vulnerable, it sounds like.
Yes, I mean, when you start to unpick it, it's both beautiful and dangerous. The beauty is that the poet has a fluid imagination and an ability to imagine, to dream, to prophesy, to be open. But on the other hand, the dangerous thing is the eternal child. The child can be very destructive. I mean, children are very destructive. They can say terrible things. I mean, they can be very, very hurtful because they just spit it out. They don't have a filter. And they can also be destructive physically, breaking things, no sense of worth of objects. So we got books like Golding's Lord of the Flies, children as dangerous. But then actually, I talked earlier on about the Romantics. In the Romantic movement, the 19th century poets in the English tradition, like Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, great poets of that Romantic movement, the child was central, absolutely central. And why? But because it was the image of the child of innocence. They had this thing about the child and innocence, so it's a bit naive, but and the child's ability to relate to nature without a filter, just to sort of have a direct communion. So, for example, Coleridge, the poet Coleridge, who wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and great poems, in his diaries, I think, or in a letter to somebody, he talks about his child. What was his child called now? I can't remember, begins with H. How did he educate his child? When there was a full moon, he took his child out into the garden and held him up to see the full moon. So he wanted his child as I don't know how old, maybe a baby, like just hold it, and then the full moon shining on the baby, the infant, and the baby looking up at the full moon. And this was Coleridge's idea of, not sit down, read your book, do your mathematics, do exercise 22 on page 94, and make sure that you get 10 out of 10. It wasn't that sort of education. It was taking them out and looking at the moon, So they had this notion. Although one of the poets, Blake, he was thinking, if you don't know him, he's a great poet to go to, William Blake. And he wrote two collections, one called The Song of Innocence and one called The Song of Experience. And he was very individualist. He didn't go to university. A lot of the other poets were, very often in the past, writers were educated because they were the ones that had the education, they were literate, and they had the time, to write. If you were a worker, where do you find time to write? But Blake wasn't, and I think he benefited from not going to university and not being in a coterie of educated people, because he didn't have preconceptions. So he didn't have a preconception of the child maybe rather middle class preconception of children being all sweet and innocent, you know. So he's got this collection of poems, Songs of Innocence, which is very much seeing the world through the eyes of the child and the so-called innocence of the child, and then Songs of Experience, seeing the world, the darker side of the world, the shadow side of the world. So he's one of the Romantic poets who kind of got more of the complete picture. I'm completely lost now. I'm rambling on. Where are we, Deniz?
I was actually thinking, how about you? How do you see your own poetry? How do you know, what kind of poetry that excites you?
What poetry can
I mean,
excite?
that you were talking about the different schools and different people,
Yes,
and
yes,
they wrote their
yes,
experience, and then we talk about dreams, we talk about, you know, symbols, we don't talk about experience, you know,
yes, yes,
emotions. But in a way, I'm also interested with how do you interpret this within your
yes. Yes, I've now you asked that question. It's immediately made me think of last year, I believe it was, a poetry publisher in London asked. They have a competition, poetry competition every year. They invite people to send in poems. They get a lot. They get like over 1,000 poems are sent to them, and then they ask a poet to be the judge. And on last year, I think it was last year or the year before, I think it was last year, they asked me to be the judge. So I was duly sent. They did what they did was, and they made it clear to the people participating that they do an initial reading, because you can see some poems are not good, and some poems are not poems. They're kind of, you know, just stuff on paper. So they kind of sifted through it. So they say, you know, well, he doesn't have to read all of this stuff because it could drive you crazy reading 1,000 poems. And then they sent me, I can't remember, maybe 200 of what they thought were the best poems. And then for me to judge, to make a first, second, and third choice, just like in the Olympics, you know, the gold, silver, and bronze sort of thing. So I read through them, and I had absolutely no preconceptions of what I wanted, other than monitoring my own response. And so it's about a poem that I like. I think that any poet will say that is, you just get stopped in your tracks when you read it. There's a sudden heightened feeling. I think it was Hardy talks about, Thomas Hardy. He's a poet and a novelist. Talks about a physical reaction, an actual physical reaction to a good poem. I think he talks about, you know, that old thing about hair standing up on the back of your head, which I've never quite understood. My hair's too long to stand up at the back of my head, but some physical response in your body, in your actual body, not in your mind. So your actual body registers something when you read a poem that's really communicating with you and getting to you. I suppose it's what people mean when they talk about being moved by something. So moving is a physical thing. It's a metaphor because, of course, emotions move as well. But that verb is physical as well as
Mm.
abstract. And so it's that sudden tensing of the body, or somehow your head, you focus a bit more, you feel it's something in your nervous system is kind of responding to it. And then you want to read it again. A lot of the poems, you kind of read them and you thought, you know, and then the ones that had something, you wanted to read them again. And of course, poems are like onions. They've got many layers, and with each reading, you often get a different meaning will emerge. Different's the wrong word, maybe an additional meaning. So, you know, the layers of meaning, and that makes a good poem. It's complexity, it's architecture, it's archaeology. You know how, you know, like when you go digging for something, you might come across a church, an old church, and then you go deeper and you find a temple. and you go deeper and you find a Neolithic burial site. You know, it's that sort of going down into it. And then you look at and then the craft was important. How did they achieve this? Because you can't just throw down a bunch of words on a page. They've got to be put together in a certain way. So then you look at the craft of the poem, and then you start to admire the craft. So not necessarily end rhymes, very often not end rhymes, but there might be internal rhymes. There might be a rhythm pattern. Then there might be the building up of a climax in a subtle way. There might be a way of setting it out on the page where the white space is working with the poem. Things like that. The aesthetics, the mechanism of the poem. And then the final thing, which is the important thing, is to then put the poems away and then to let a few days go by and then to see which poems are still there in your head. Because one of the most important, I mean, I always think the best compliment ever is when people remember your poems. You know, they've heard them once or twice. Oh, I remember your poem about da 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 da. Because those are poems that stick in your, you know, so they've obviously found something inside you that is relating to them, and they stick in your, they've got into your synapses or something, and they're there. And so then, you know, I'd wake up and I'd be thinking about one of the poems that I was judging, and I was thinking, oh yes, that's resonating with me. And then I'd turn those 200 poems into 100, then I'd turn them into 10, then I would turn them into 5, and that would be the sort of process. So those would be the sort of things I was looking for. And it didn't matter what the content was or what they were trying to say. It was unimportant. It was the overall, the success of achieving a work of art that communicates from one human being to another, but on a scale which is both conscious and unconscious.
Okay, so it has to invoke emotions. I know, let me try to convey how I understand it and correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
It has to bring emotions. It should be multiple meanings could be construed. And then it has to resonate and stay with you. In a way, you are actually talking about a therapeutic relationship. It's a relationship that you build with that poem, and then it's there, and then it transforms you. It makes you think about it. It brings emotions. And then the more you look at it, you can construct different meanings out of it. Now,
so in your analogy, is the poem the therapist and the reader the client?
yes.
That's interesting.
Yes. It makes sense to me.
Mm.
Although there's one big difference is poet also is occupied with aesthetically pleasing, making it beautiful, than just conveying a message.
Yeah, two things. Got to be very careful about the beauty thing, because people get hung up on that, and contemporary poetry it is not necessarily dealing with beauty. I mean, I was in my poetry group the other night. A poet wrote a poem about a relationship between a heroin addict mother and her son, and there were, I won't repeat them now because I'll be misquoting, but they're very strong images, shocking images, using swear words, body parts, interactions that are not what you would call beautiful. And I had this problem at the beginning of my salon, that people kept rabbiting on about beauty, and because very often art house films are dealing with strange and dark things, you know, and then I'd have some people around the table saying, oh, that was ugly, that was horrible, that's not art, that's not. And I had to say, you know, art isn't isn't about beauty. I mean, you know, so I think a
Mm,
lot of people have got this idea of, you know, like a chocolate box, you know, like a beautiful garden with a little bridge and, you know, blue sky, maybe some little clouds and maybe, you know, a shepherd with a, you know, that's so I have to be careful. I'm wary of that word beauty. So I wouldn't say that the poet expresses beauty unless it's the kind of beauty that John Keats was talking about, one of the great um, romantic poets, when he said, "Truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That is all there is and all you need to know." And so in that sense, if you're saying that truth is beauty, beauty is truth, then okay, then beauty. But that's not how a lot of people mean beauty when they're talking about beauty now. That they mean something that makes you like, oh, isn't that nice? You know, something that doesn't challenge you, something that
mm.
makes you feel relaxed, something that makes you feel harmonious, you know, and so that, and then what was the other thing I wanted? Oh yes, yeah, emotion. I hope I didn't give the idea when I was talking about my I did give the idea when I was talking about my judging of the poetry, that it was just emotion, because there's also intellectual response, because
Mm,
emotion sounds as if it's just like, oh, ooh, you know, like, oh, poor thing, oh, but there's intellect, you know, when the brain starts crackling, like, what a clever philosophical point, what, you know, in your brain's like crackle, 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 and that's not emotion, it's a kind of an intellectual response. So I'm not just a big gooey emotional, you know, like, oh, kind of a judge. I was also a very intellectual judge, looking for ideas in the poem and how those ideas were expressed through metaphor, simile, or whatever, or the whole construct of the poem.
that's one of the things that happens is we are not taught to recognize our emotions, and we grow up with our own experience, and we tend to think about emotions in a singular concept, but actually it's ultimately complex process. There could be more than many you might be feeling many emotions at once, but the one way of the identifying them would be they are one word. You can express your emotion with one word. I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling sad, I'm joyous, I'm excited, I'm disgusted. But this is something that I ask a lot, and I tell them, can you describe the happiest memory of you? You know, in your whole life, what is your happiest memory? And people often say, it was with my mom. And it's like, what are you feeling? They said, I was so happy. And it's like, just stay with it, just like free association. And they said, I was also sad. Some people were saying that I was afraid because I was on a school and I was supposed to talk with someone. And it's not just gooey things, it's also physical sensations in our life. And I mean, that it has a physical effect on us as well. And I think it's not just being gooey or not, emotions dictates our lives more than anything, perhaps.
Yes, yes, yeah, absolutely. Um, so are you saying that that an emotional response can involve an intellectual response?
Of course, it has to, because it is also connected with how you think. It also brings back your memories. It also brings connected with how you behave and how you engage with things, not just poetry, or it's in every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, 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 definitely.
And by the way, we're almost out of time, and
Okay,
our conversation is tremendously interesting for me. I could go for hours, because
that's
one thing that we agreed is we sat down and we were thinking, how could we make this, we record this podcast, and then we said maybe the best way is not to come up with a structure, not to pre-talk, and not to turn into a lecture, but keep it as a
yes.
conversation.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Very important.
And I am so happy that you brought at least one of your poems here, and then we talk about so many things, and I try to bring a different kind of approach to the psychological approach and theory a little bit into it.
Yes, yes, no, that was fascinating. I mean, I'd like to talk to you more about it.
Yes.
I think there's such a rich and generative dialogue to be had between poetry and psychology, and it as I say, it is being explored now, but I think it's a very rich, big area. I mean, if any of your students want to think of an area for research, that would be a fabulous area for research.
I recently attended a postgraduate forum for the BACP, and there was a researcher, and she was working with Alzheimer and the therapist that works with the clients with Alzheimer, and then she was doing a proper PhD research, and she said it didn't make sense to me. And then she introduced me into poetic inquiry. She did interviews, and then from those interviews, she turned what her findings into lines of poetry. And then she says, for me to be able to make sense of it, I need cadence, I need a rhythm, I need to be able to move through what I read, it needs to connect for me. And then she used poetic inquiry. It is tremendously interesting for me.
Yes, yeah, that sounds great.
By the way, Dino, if our students or people who watches us are interested in with poetry, I think they can find you from your website, are they? Can they?
Yes, yeah, they can.
I think it is dinomahoney.com, was it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And because you have this regular poetry groups where you discuss and poetry.
Yeah, they're workshops. There were Zoom workshops. That all started from COVID. We used to do them face to face, and then with COVID went online, and then discovered that online is a great way to have poetry workshops, because we then became international. So then we have people from all over the world. Yeah, I do that once a month.
And thank you for coming here and discussing your vast knowledge of poetry and literature, and the way that you see world is really important for us. And for people who watches us, thank you, or listening us from Spotify. And
and that's a Gigi, and
that's Gigi.
Poets love cats. The one animal that poets always write about are cats, because cats are poets. They've got free association, and they're very uninhibited, and they're very imaginative. Say goodbye, Gigi. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Gigi. And I guess I have to say this, but if you like this podcast, then you can subscribe to New York College YouTube channel and Spotify, and you can get notification once we have new episodes, and we will see you on September. And thank you, Dino.
Thank you very much, Deniz. It was a great pleasure. It was lovely talking to you, and the time flew by.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Oh, hope to talk to you again, and have a nice day.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.